Hello and welcome to this exciting episode of Ranking the World's Worst People. In this channel, we walk you through the life and evil acts of the worst people in the world, and then we rank them and give them a score at the end of each episode. Our goal is to put all the worst people who've ever lived in one single league with videos that let you know exactly what they've done, so you can help us rank them in the comments as well. Now, let's have a quick look at the league and how it stands at the moment. But remember, this is just our scores, and all the comments that will be submitted during the season will be added in the last episode of this season. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at Trofim Lysenko. Norman Vincent Peale said, "The trouble with most of us is that we would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. So many people love to be praised, and they let praise get into their heads. What we fail to realize is that those that are willing to praise us will also be ever willing to speak against us if the situation changes. Then, there are some set of people that cannot take any form of criticism. They would do everything in their power to punish critics. Trofim Lysenko falls into both categories. He let praise from the Soviet media, and he had those who dared criticize his policies executed." Who was Trofim Lysenko? Trofim Lysenko, born September 29, 1898, was a Soviet biologist who led a campaign of agricultural science, now known as Lysenkoism, a campaign that went explicitly against contemporary agricultural genetics and lasted until the mid-1960s in the USSR. He classified genetics as pseudoscience, when in fact his science probably falls into the same category. Lysenko became head of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences of the Soviet Union, and he placed his science at the service of the Soviet state. The biologist played an instrumental role in purging and eliminating hundreds of scientists who refused to play the propaganda game demanded by the Soviet state that credited Lysenko with all manner of scientific discoveries. The Soviet media depicted him as the very embodiment of Soviet peasant genius, almost celebrating his comparative lack of genuine scientific training. Lysenko was finally discredited, but not after he had destroyed the careers of many scientists of promise. On a positive note, the excesses of his policy stimulated resistance to the ideological control of science toward the end days of the USSR. And his legacy best serves as a lesson in the moral bankruptcy of any regime that tries to control the intellectual life of its citizens. Biography. Trofim Lysenko was born Trofim Lysenko to a peasant family that lived in Karlivka, Poltava Oblast, Ukraine, on 29th of September, 1898. He was the son of Denis Lysenko and his wife Oksana. Being the oldest of 4 children, he helped them around the family farm. He was a bit later in learning to read, but eventually attended the Umam School of Horticulture in 1921, and in 1925 he studied agronomy at the Kiev Agricultural Institute. When Lysenko was 29, he had the opportunity to work in Azerbaijan at an agricultural experiment station, where he researched fertilization, the response of seeds and seedlings to low temperature, and he published a research paper in 1928 showing that freezing seeds made them germinate more quickly. It was an unorthodox method to fertilize fields without using fertilizers or minerals, going on to prove that a winter crop of peas could be grown in Azerbaijan by turning the barren fields of the Transcaucasus green in winter so that cattle would not perish from poor feeding, and the peasant Turk will live through the winter without trembling for tomorrow. A typical peasant miracle of the early Soviet press. However, the winter crop of peas failed in succeeding years. Such would be the pattern of Lysenko's success with the Soviet media from 1927 until 1964. Reports of amazing and almost impossible successes, which would be replaced with claims of new successes once the old ones became failures. What mattered more to the press was that Lysenko was a barefoot scientist, an embodiment of the mythical Soviet peasant genius. A peasant hero. Lysenko's science wasn't an introduction to any new theory. In fact, when he proposed any theories, they were generally a mishmash of Lamarckism and various forms of Darwinism. The majority of Lysenko's work consisted of so-called practical directions for agriculture, such as cooling grain before it was planted. Lysenko's primary procedure was a mixture of vernalization, by which Lysenko generally meant anything he did to plant seeds and tubers, as well as hybridization. During one period, for example, he picked spring wheat with a short stage of vernalization, but a long, light stage, which he crossed with another variety of wheat with a long stage of vernalization and a short light stage. He did not explain what was meant by these stages. Instead, he concluded based on his stage theory that he knew in advance that the cross was most likely to produce offspring that would ripen sooner, thereby yielding more than their parents. As a result of his knowledge, Lysenko did not have to test many plants through their generations. Lysenko's message was extremely welcome, attracting a lot of attention for him. And Lysenko, even though he was poorly educated as a biologist, had a very acute political sense. He presented himself in such a way that the authorities would support him. He was never a member of the Communist Party, but he was clever enough to portray himself as a simple peasant's son who had discovered new ways to grow crops that were superior to old ways. And he turned to the government and said, "I would like to help you do what you want to do with my new methods." Well, they loved that, And the crisis was so great that no one said, "Well, let's just verify some of his claims. Does he use control groups? Does he use statistics? Are these verifiable claims?" The answer to all those questions was no. Nonetheless, because of the politics of the time, they supported him and fed his ambitions. Although Lysenko was scientifically unsound on a number of levels, his outrageous claims seemed to delight Soviet journalists and agricultural officials, as they sped up laboratory work and cheapened it considerably. Lysenko was given his own journal, Vernalization, in 1935, with which he generally bragged about forthcoming successes. However, what most caught the Soviet government's eye about Lysenko was his success at motivating peasants. Soviet agriculture was deeply damaged by the forced collectivization movement in the early 1930s, and many peasants were, at best, unenthusiastic. The government found it extremely difficult to convince the peasants. In fact, the peasants were more than willing to destroy their grain to keep it away from the Soviet government. It was Lysenko who energized the enthusiasm of the peasants, making them feel truly in control and participants in the great Soviet revolutionary experiment. By the late 1920s, the Soviet political bosses had given their support to Lysenko. Much of what Lysenko did as time went by was to make disparaging remarks about academic scientists, particularly geneticists. He claimed that their isolated laboratory work was not helping the Soviet people, and there was no need for them. Personally, Lysenko was quick to anger and could tolerate no criticism. The skeptics of Lysenko were soon to know what it means to criticize him. By 1929, they were politically censored for only being able to criticize rather than prescribe new solutions. In December 1929, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin gave a famous speech elevating practice above theory, elevating the judgment of the political bosses above that of the scientists and technical specialists, giving people license to put ideological view above scientific research and even practical common sense. At first, the Soviet government under Stalin gave much more support to genuine agricultural scientists, but this changed pretty soon in 1935. The balance of power abruptly swung towards Lysenko and his followers. A new era, Lysenkoism. In Russia at this time, all scientists' experiments were funded by the Soviet government. Since Lysenko somehow had Stalin among his believers, Lysenko was safe from scrutiny by other scientists who believed in different solutions to the famine or who contradicted Lysenko's findings. In fact, if a scientist so much as countered Lysenko and made it known to Stalin, it became an end to their scientific career. In 1935, Lysenko was put in charge of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences of the Soviet Union and president of the Lenin Academy of Agricultural Sciences in 1938. He ordered millions of acres of farmland to be sown using his methods with varying results. He was charged with the duty to end the propagation of harmful ideas among Soviet scientists. Lysenko served this purpose faithfully, and by 1939, he was leading a new era known as Lysenkoism. At the helm of affairs, Lysenko did and said what he wanted. One time, he made an outrageous claim that he had produced rye from wheat plants and cuckoo birds from warblers. The concept of Lysenkoism collided with all that was known about Darwinian evolution and Mendelian inheritance. Lysenko found an easy solution: disparage Darwin and Mendel. He would say, "I'm trying to help the country. I'm doing good work for agriculture. and we've got these bourgeois biologists out there in their laboratories. They're working with fruit flies and things that have nothing to do with agriculture. They're fly lovers and people haters. That was one of his phrases. And he said, they're actually wrecking our agriculture by deflecting us, diverting our attention from the main task at hand, which is to grow wheat and rye and other crops. Even though Lysenko's ideas intersected with the old theory of French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck on the inheritance of acquired characters, he claimed that his theory was not Lamarckist. In fact, he found a more appropriate framework for his proposals: communism. In the face of Mendelian inheritance, determined by genes from before birth, Lysenko advocated a system where the environment could achieve anything. Lysenko published his book, Heredity and Its Variability, in 1943, which detailed his views that heredity can be changed by husbandry. In 1948, Lysenko published a report to the Russian Academy detailing his genetic theories and denying the existence of genes and chromosomes. His unique views became more widely known throughout the world. British evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley was particularly outspoken and scathing regarding Lysenko's views. To counter Darwinian competition, Lysenko proposed that plants cooperated with each other. Although he never intended to apply his theories to the human being, his ideological positioning and the promise of bountiful harvests continued to earn him the favors of the Soviet regime. This period saw the expulsion, imprisonment, and death of hundreds of scientists, and the end of genetics throughout the Soviet Union. His most prominent opponent was the prominent Soviet biologist Nikolai Vavilov, the founder of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences. He died of starvation in prison at the hands of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD. Life after Stalin. When Stalin died in 1953, Lysenko was supported by the new leader Nikita Khrushchev. However, mainstream scientists were now given the ability to criticize Lysenko for the first time since the late 1920s, and it marked the beginning of the end of Lysenko's dominance. In 1962, three of the most prominent Soviet physicists, Yakov Borisovich Zeldovich, Vitaly Ginzburg, and Pyotr Kapitsa, set out the case against Lysenko, debunking his false science claims, works, and his policy of political extermination of scientific opponents. They also pointed out how Lysenko made use of his political influence to protect him from criticism and denounced those who were making a valid fight to reveal factual claims. This happened as part of a greater trend of combating the ideological influence that had held such sway in Soviet society and science. In 1964, physicist Andrei Sakharov also countered Lysenko's claims and spoke to the General Assembly of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Sakharov remarked, "He is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists." It didn't take long before Lysenko fell from grace to grass. The Soviet press was soon filled with anti-Lysenkoite articles and appeals for the restoration of scientific methods to all fields of biology and agricultural science. In 1965, Lysenko was removed from his directorship and restricted to an experimental farm in Moscow's Lenin Hills. Things got worse for Lysenko after the dismissal of Khrushchev in 1964. The president of the Academy of Sciences declared that Lysenko's immunity to criticism had officially ended, and an expert commission was sent to Lysenko's experimental farm. A few months later, a devastating critique became public, and Lysenko's reputation was completely destroyed in the Soviet Union, although it would continue to have effect in China for many years. Death. Deposed as director of the Institute of Genetics early in 1965, Lysenko seemed to be at the end of his mutable career. He and his followers, however, long retained their degrees, their titles, and their academic positions, and remained free to support their aberrant trend in biology. Trofim Lysenko died in Moscow on the 10th of November, 1976, aged 78. A reemergence of Lysenkoism. One might think that with the starvation report from when Lysenkoism was introduced and then discredited, there won't ever be a mention of it ever again. You'll be surprised to know that there's actually a resurgence of Lysenkoism going on in Russia right now. People in the West are especially taken aback by this recent development, but it is happening. And one of the reasons it's happening is that there is a new field in biology from the last 20 to 25 years called epigenetics. What do you think? Although not the best standard, Trofim Lysenko's scientific training was comparatively modest. It was the state-controlled media that, in fact, encouraged him to claim scientific achievement with the way it publicized his policies. Soviet propaganda was anxious to promote the idea of the phenomenal abilities of Soviet peasants. Lysenko saw the situation and took advantage of it. Do you think that the same media that elevated him to an undeserved height is right to say disparaging things about him later on? Do you feel he deserved a worse punishment than he got? Let us know in the comments section below. Ratings. Trofim Lysenko lived with his peasant family. He didn't start to read and write as early as some of his peers. When he eventually went to school, he rose up to the top in a way that he could not have talked about. He could have humbly rejected some of the undeserved praise he was getting, but he didn't. He let it go to his head. His agricultural policies led to the death of so many. Those that dared to criticize him were made to suffer the consequences of doing so. So, going by our ratings, where 1 is refusing to tip and 100 is the worst human to ever live, we would give Trofim Lysenko 37. Because although he was responsible for the death of some scientists, he wasn't the only one culpable. Also, he didn't eat any people as Albert Fish. Now, this puts him here in our league, and he is quite a far bit away from the top. How would you rate him after what you've seen today? Leave a comment in the comments section, and we will count your score in the last episode to make our revised league. And if you missed the episode of John McAfee, then watch it here. You might be surprised of how a Silicon Valley superstar can do a 180 degree and become one of the worst people in the world. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, or learned something new. Also, subscribe and press the notification bell so you'll be the first to get updated when our new episode comes out. See you next time. Goodbye.